Hello and welcome. This episode is a two-parter, the first part featuring leaders of today and the second featuring leaders of tomorrow. First up, we're going to hear short extracts from the brief speeches given by three people at the leaders segment that kicked off COP29. We're going to hear from UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, the UN's chief climate scientist Jim Skea, and the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mottley. I'm a big fan of Prime Minister Mottley, who has worked hard to ensure that COPs deliver the climate finance necessary for developing countries to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. Not only that, she's worked in conjunction with global economists, financial institutions, and other national governments, including the French government, to identify ways to overhaul international financial systems. Her goal is to ensure that global financial systems take account of climate change and don't systematically disadvantage poor countries. And you can read more about that in the work of the Bridgetown Initiative, which she refers to in her speech. Then we're going to hear from two leaders of tomorrow, Kemel Soalablai and Charlie Bevis, who are both involved in the Youth Negotiators Academy. I'll tell you more about Toni and Charlie a bit later on, but I think you'll be amazed at what the Academy has achieved in a very short space of time. You'll also be fascinated with their answers when I ask them how different these negotiations would be if it wasn't a conference of the parties, but was instead a conference of the parties' youth. Toni is from the island nation of Palau, a nation she describes as tiny but mighty, and I think you'll be intrigued by her comments on the Palau Pledge, a passport-like declaration made to the children of Palau, which all visitors to the island must sign. By signing, they pledge to the children to preserve and protect Palau and to ensure that the only footprints they leave are those that will wash away. Really, it's a good metaphor for what negotiators are trying to do at COP. Okay, let's kick things off with some edited remarks by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
Excellencies and friends, the sound you hear is the ticking clock. We are in the final countdown to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And time is not on our side. Exhibit A 2024, with the hottest day on record and the hottest months on record. This is almost certain to be the hottest year on record. And this is a story of avoidable injustice. The rich cause the problem, the poor pay the highest price. Oxfam finds the richest billionaires emit more carbon in an hour and a half than the average person does in a lifetime. Now, unless emissions plummet and adaptation soars, every economy will face far greater fury. But there is every reason to hope. Excellencies, at COP28, all you agreed to move away from fossil fuels, to accelerate net zero energy systems, setting milestones to get there, to boost climate adaptation, and to align the next round of economy-wide national climate action plans, or NDCs, with 1.5 degree limits. It's time to deliver. Humanity is behind you. A poll by the University of Oxford and the United Nations Development Programme finds that 80% of people around the world want more climate action. Scientists, activists, and young people are demanding change. They must be heard, not silenced. And the economic imperative is clearer and more compelling. With every renewables rollout, every innovation, and every price drop. Last year, and for the first time, the amount invested in grids and renewables overtook the amount spent on fossil fuels. And almost everywhere, solar and wind are the cheapest source of new electricity. So doubling down on fossil fuels is absurd. The clean energy revolution is here. No group, no business, and no government can stop it. But you can and must ensure it is fair and fast enough to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I urge you to focus on three priorities. First, emergency emissions reductions. To limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we must cut global emissions 9% every year. By 2030, they must be down 43% on 2019 levels. Unfortunately, they are still growing at the present moment. Now, at this COP, you must agree to rules for fair, effective carbon markets that support that fight. Yesterday, you made an important first step. You must build on it by agreeing rules for markets that respect the rights of local communities and leave no space for greenwashing or land grabbing. By next COP, you must deliver new economy-wide national climate action plans. And you have agreed that your new plans will align with 1.5 degrees. That means they must cover all emissions and the whole economy. Advance global goals to triple renewables capacity, double energy efficiency, and halt deforestation by 2030. To slash global fossil fuel production and consumption 30% by the same date. And to align national energy transition strategies and sustainable development priorities with climate action to attract the needed investment. All countries must do their part, and the G20 must lead. They are the largest emitters with the greatest capacities and responsibilities. Excellencies. Second, you must do more to protect your people from the ravages of the climate crisis. The most vulnerable are being abandoned to climate extremes. The gap between adaptation needs and finance could reach up to $359 billion a year by 2030. And these missing dollars are not abstractions on a balance sheet. They are lives taken, harvests lost, and development denied. Now more than ever, finance promises must be kept. We also need a fundamental step change across the board. And so, Excellencies, the third priority is finance. Developing countries eager to act are facing many obstacles. Scant public finance, raging cost of capital, crashing climate disasters, and debt servicing that soaks up funds. The result, adaptation denied, and a tale of two transitions. Last year, developing and emerging markets outside China received just 15 cents per every dollar invested in clean energy globally. COP29 must tear down the walls of climate finance. Developing countries must not leave Baku empty-handed. A deal is a must, and I'm confident it will be reached. We need a new finance goal that meets the moment. Big sums require big change. There is no time to lose. On climate finance, the world must pay up, or humanity will pay the price. Excellencies, in these crucial periods, you and your governments must be guided by a clear truth. Climate finance is not charity, it's an investment. Climate action is not optional, it's an imperative. Both are indispensable to a livable world for all humanity and a prosperous future for every nation on earth. The clock is ticking. I count on you, and I thank you.
Now we're going to hear from the UN's top climate scientist, Jim Skea.
As the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, it's an honour to address the high-level segment of COP29. Climate change is no longer an abstract threat for a distant future. It's been unfolding in front of our eyes. In the 12 months since the last COP in the UAE, people across Asia and in the Sahel have endured extreme temperatures. Communities in the Americas have fought against devastating wildfires, and flood defences were put to the test in Central Europe when confronted with intense rainfall. Not to mention more recent events in Valencia. Many people have lost their homes, their livelihoods, and their lives. Communities have been shaken to their core. And global warming is unequivocally caused by human activities through emissions of greenhouse gases that arise from unsustainable energy use, land use and land use change, and lifestyle patterns. The extremes we are witnessing have been aggravated by human-induced climate change. This is the new normal. Imagine what is in store in the coming decades if we don't act swiftly and decisively. With every fraction of a degree of warming, we face greater threats. Children born today will not know a world without climate change. The IPCC has shown that we, and furthermore they, will live in a world marked by more intense storms, exceptional heat waves, devastating floods and droughts, a world where food chains are disrupted and where diseases reach new countries. Today, our chances of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius are hanging on a very slender thread. The recent UNEP GAP report concluded that global emissions would need to fall by 7.5% per year through to 2035 to return us to a 1.5 degree pathway. If we delay more ambitious action to 2030, this becomes an unprecedented 15% per year. Even limiting warming to 2 degrees is at risk. But this does not have to be the case. As the IPCC 6th Assessment Report demonstrated, we have the know-how, the tools and the financial resources to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. A world where transport is no longer polluting, our cities are green, and where we have transitioned away from fossil fuels. We've shown that carbon pricing, regulations and other interventions have already resulted in gigatons of avoided emissions, and more can be achieved if policies and measures are scaled up and deployed more widely. Furthermore, we've shown that climate action can contribute to other development goals, such as improving air quality and human health. With climate change already on us, we must address adaptation. The IPCC will be paying particular attention to this in the coming cycle. Most adaptation so far is fragmented, small in scale, incremental, sector-specific, and focused more on planning than implementation. But we can take measures to address the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity, and pollution. We can increase our resilience to the impacts of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished excellencies, the IPCC will continue to provide timely, robust, policy-relevant information to support accelerated adaptation efforts and cuts in emissions. But the resolution of this global crisis is now in your hands. Decisions made here at COP29 will shape the legacy we leave behind to our children and grandchildren, and for the billions of people who deserve a livable planet. Thank you for your attention.
Now let's hear from the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies. It is fitting that this 29th COP should take place here in this beautiful city of Baku, standing as it does the sentinel between East and West, or between the global North and the global South, a bridge between the ancient, the modern, and indeed the future, with the majestic Caucasus Mountains behind us, reminding us of the heights that we must now scale in order to be successful in this process. We are in the midst of a climate crisis. We are in a season of superlatives. And the reality is that these extreme weather events that the world is facing daily suggest that humanity and the planet are hurtling towards catastrophe. The extreme weather requires from us a serious commitment at this COP with respect to new collective quantified goals that enable us to reverse the current trajectory and to fund mitigation, adaptation, and of course loss and damage. This commitment must encompass 7 critical elements. 1. The proper capitalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. The reality is that the Loss and Damage Fund has only attracted $700 million. And this is despite the numerous crises besetting small island developing states. Secondly, proper capitalization of developing countries must also include and have access to cheaper, longer-term capital in circumstances where they can scale up investments for adaptation. Thirdly, by adopting the principles, in our view, of Bridgetown Initiative 3.0 through the delivery of urgently needed financial reforms, we must change the rules of the game, shock-proof vulnerable economies, and indeed review debt sustainability while at the same time augmenting resources. Fourthly, rich countries must deliver on their commitments. We must ensure, time and again, that the commitments made, whether for 0.7% of GNI, or indeed the $100 billion, or recently the $30 billion with respect to biodiversity, that these are met. We must have transparency and accountability on the part of everyone. Fifthly, we must agree in principle that developed countries and carbon producers can, in fact, along with others who are willing, help us find new money to augment the resources. We accept that the current commitments of public money may not be sufficient, and therefore we need to consider levies, as the Global Solidarity Levies Committee and Coalition is seeking to do. If we put a $5 per ton on CO2 for fossil fuel extraction, we can raise $210 billion a year. If we put $100 per ton on CO2 for shipping, we can raise in excess of $80 billion a year. And we've not addressed aviation or indeed the elephant in the room, a 0.1% levy on all bonds and stocks that can raise us in excess of $400 billion. Sixthly, we need to deal with methane. Methane is responsible for 45% of current global warming and is 80 times as devilish as CO2 with respect to warming the planet. This makes mitigation of methane the most effective way to slow the rate of warming in our world. And I trust and pray that we can have a global methane agreement, as Pope Francis led the call earlier this year for us to see a parallel track to decarbonization. Finally, we need high-integrity carbon markets to ensure that there is fairness, and that we need a universal carbon pricing mechanism to remove the disparity between countries in the north and south. My friends, every COP must make progress irrespective of the geopolitical dynamics. There is an urgent need to reform this COP process, and I hope that we can meet that as we go forward. As we leave this city of winds and land of fire, may we ensure that our ambitions are not only high, but our actions mimic the ambitions which we have, if we are to ensure that our people are not to be the victims of this awful climate crisis. Thank you.
Now it's time to hear from two members of the Youth Negotiators Academy, which trains young people how to be negotiators at the UN climate change talks. Charlie Bevis is a climate change and carbon markets lawyer who studied and trained in the UK and now works in Melbourne. He has been involved with climate and youth advocacy for several years, reporting on UN climate conferences with Climate Talk to educate young people about the climate crisis. He also served as the UK's climate change delegate to the G20 Youth Summit. Charlie now works as the Youth Negotiator Academy's advocacy lead. Toni Kemel Soalablai is Director of Communications at Friends of the Palau National Marine Sanctuary. In this role, Toni creates social media campaigns, develops marketing materials for the Palau Pledge, which we'll hear more about later, and educates Palau's young students about the importance of preserving Palau's natural environment. Welcome, Toni and Charlie.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, happy to be here.
Charlie, first up, could you tell us a bit about the Youth Negotiators Academy, or YNA as it's called, and what it's achieved?
Yeah, sure. So the history of the YNA, we were found very recently, only in April 2022. by our 4 co-founders, Marie-Claire, Hita, Vina, and Sophie. And our origin story is that Marie-Claire was actually Switzerland's first youth climate negotiator at the UNFCCC, a few years ago now. And when she was in that space, she really noticed 2 things. One was how few youth negotiators there were. And the other was that those that were there really did not have the skills and knowledge to be able to meaningfully participate. Even though they had that great privilege of access to the space, they couldn't then leverage it. So this sort of brainchild was created of how we could get more young people in and also give them the skills to, meaningfully use that opportunity once they were here. So the YNA was founded, and how it works is that we partner with different countries around the world, primarily in the global south. And we basically say to them, if you give us 2 spaces in your delegation, we will train up 2 young people from your country with the skills to be able to negotiate at the UNFCCC. And, that's a very big thing, because each convention or conference that you're negotiating at the UN has its very own particular systems and requirements. It's incredibly technical. So it's a real capacity building that we're undertaking. And now this will be our 3rd COP that we're attending, because we launched at COP27. So now at COP29, we have 63 partner countries. We have 111 youth negotiators here at the conference. 53 are fully funded by the YNA to attend as well. And also, I will say that over the course of the year, we're also training other young people to be negotiators, but not all of them can attend COP29. But in total, we have trained over 300 young people to negotiate under the UNFCCC. And just to give you an eye as to what that capacity building looks like. So, as I say, we've only been operating at COP for 3 years now, but our YNA negotiators or alumni of previous years, 4 of the deputy heads of delegation, so that's the second most senior negotiator in a delegation, are YNA negotiators or alumni. And the systemic impact that you see where we have so many people that have come through the program, young people in this space that have these really strong relationships with one another from coming through the training, because it's usually the case that delegations train in silos. So they train as a national delegation. And we're really disrupting that by running a training program in which our cohorts build really strong relationships with each other across international boundaries, and then bring that into this space. And we've heard so many stories in which youth negotiators have come through our academy, know one another, enter this space, and then where there are roadblocks or issues in the negotiations, they've been able to navigate those by communicating with one another about a potential workaround, bringing that back to their delegations. The delegations have been getting on board. And that's so meaningful for us at the YNA to hear about the impact of our work. Because, for us, it isn't just about getting young people into this space, even though that is so important, or just about giving them the skills to have that meaningful impact. Again, even though that is so important, but we're all here to advance these talks, to get this deal over the line and to create bolder solutions. And, through all of the above, it's so rewarding to be a part of the YNA team in which we're seeing that action happen, and we're seeing the impact that we're able to have in advancing these talks.
It's clearly an extraordinary program. Toni, could you tell us a bit about why you got involved in the Youth Negotiators Academy and its Climate Youth Negotiator program, what you've learnt from it, what connections you've made, and what the benefits have been for you?
I actually went to Dubai last year for COP28 as support for the Palau delegation. And of course, just my background in ocean conservation came with the idea that I would find as many people as I could to help fund my programs back home, to network and connect. And I didn't realize that I actually left feeling like I actually want to get involved in this space specifically. And so I sought out my national focal point, Airbud, and I was hounding him. I was like, I want to get I want to do this. I want to get involved in this. And he pushed me forward and put me into the Climate Youth Negotiators program. And so it started months and months of Zoom calls, breakout sessions, getting to know so many youth leaders from around the world that share that same drive. And over time, I came to understand myself that we have so many different parts that move in tandem with each other. So I am a youth delegate from the Gambia or Zimbabwe or any other parts of the Pacific. We are in this together, and we have similar interests, but very different critical problems. And learning from each other, even through a screen, I didn't realize was so fulfilling to me, because it gave me a space to not be shy to ask questions, not be scared of the future, and to also be more secure in myself and the work that I do. And so actually coming here to Baku and meeting everybody in person, going through the negotiation simulations, which were my favorite part of the program completely, I was like, okay, I'm really making a difference. I'm really doing something for my country. And so I went into my very first negotiation yesterday for adaptation. And I was so surprised to learn that I knew, at least some of the things that were happening. I had been reading so much. I had been talking to so many people. And it was just really exciting to be in a place, in space, and in a mindset that really brought all of this together for me. And so I have nothing but praise for the YNA team and for CYNP for really giving me all of the necessary ingredients to advocate for my country and for myself. And I'm really grateful that this is what has brought me to this place.
Thanks so much, Toni. That's a great answer. And I actually just would like to expand a bit on that experience of going into the adaptation negotiations yesterday. I'm sure you would have been more prepared with more understanding of what's going on than actually quite a few of the negotiators, because the need for adaptation, I guess, is a lived experience for you. And plus you've had this extensive training. Could you expand a bit on that experience?
Yes, of course. Yesterday, I had gone into the negotiations really excited. I was ready to process everything. And at times, it felt hard to follow because there's so many acronyms for different things, and so many different ideas that are being put into the discussion really late. And we were trying to decide on formatting the text, for example. And I had stood there and I was thinking back to our training sessions, and it was a really close stimulation that we had. And so seeing it unfold in reality was incredible to watch. This was 193 countries trying to save themselves. And being in there and seeing it all happen in real time was so humbling. And also seeing how these people who had been at these COPs for so many years, they've built relationships with each other. They know how to speak with each other, and they know how to negotiate to each other, for each other, with each other, and against each other. And so seeing that happen from one person to the next, or from one group to the next, it was so fascinating, and it kind of gave me a sense of this is really what community is about. It's always about having to compromise. It's always about how to find a way forward, or better solutions, or bolder solutions, as Charlie had mentioned earlier. This is what brings us together, and having a seat at that table and having to see it with my own eyes, it was just, I just knew that this was one of those things that, on the bigger scope of things, when you look at the bigger picture, this is what shapes those decisions and those choices. And so my very first negotiation was so scary, but also really, really, really fantastic, I would say.
Thanks for that, Toni. That was a wonderful response. Could you tell us a bit more about Palau, how it's been impacted by climate change and extreme weather, and what has been the focus of your work? And could you also tell us a bit about the Palau Pledge, which I mentioned earlier?
Palau is located in the northwestern part of the Pacific. It's in the Micronesian region. Palau has 18,000 residents. And so what I want to bring to COP or even to these climate change talks, there's 18,000 people out of almost 8 billion people in the world. And so I try my very best to make sure that those 18,000 voices are heard and acknowledged in the midst of 8 billion people. And so with that, Palau is tiny but mighty. And in order to safeguard our precious, pristine natural environments, the Palau Pledge was created as an initiative under the Palau National Marine Sanctuary. And so the Palau National Marine Sanctuary protects 80% of its waters from illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And what the Palau Pledge does is, for every visitor that comes into the country, you will get a stamp in your passport at immigration. And the Palau Pledge is a promise that you, as a visitor, will make to Palau's children and to Palau's future generations, that you will act sustainably, that you will try your best to live as a local, and as a local meaning you respect the culture, the traditions, the customs, but also to be very mindful of the way Palauans live on a day-to-day. And so the Palau Pledge has been signed over 1 million times since it launched in 2017, and it is a world-first initiative and has proved to be very successful in having that promise kept and shared and met. And so we have all these people from around the world coming to Palau, knowing that where their money goes, where their experiences go, are protected because of that promise that they make.
I imagine community engagement is essential in your conservation work. How do you connect with local communities and youth to help foster a sense of stewardship for the ocean? And what role does cultural heritage play?
For Palauan culture, we operate on the basis of community. It is always your village that takes care of you. I would like to share a little bit about that. And so for every Palauan, such as myself, I identify as my mother's daughter. And so Palau is a matrilineal society where the woman has the power to choose the chiefs that make decisions. And so for me, being my mother's daughter, I strive to emulate my mother and my grandmother and all of my mothers before me, the strength that it takes to raise a village and be a part of that village. And so my cultural heritage means so much to me, not just with my own personal identity, but how I can share that with the people around me in my community, but also with the partners that we have and the friendships, the relationships that we have on a bigger level. And so I bring that part of my culture with me always, because it's the community that matters to me. It's having a friendly conversation. It's maybe a smile here and there. But for me, being a Palauan is so basic and so second nature to me that it's kind of what drives everything around me. And so yes, ocean conservation and ocean health, they mean so much to me, but it's not just because of trying to protect and preserve those marine ecosystems, but also the people that rely on them. And without us doing that work, there will be no people, there will be no marine ecosystems. There are 18,000 Palauans out of 8 billion people. And it is so crucial that the work is being done today to ensure that tomorrow we will still have people to enjoy those things and to carry on this legacy of conservation.
Charlie, the Pacific Island nations have been very influential in efforts to fight climate change, including through the courts. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That's a really interesting point because we have seen some big developments happening in the past few years, which have been led by Pacific Island nations. So one that I'm sure people might have been following is that in 2021, Vanuatu initiated this process by which they are seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on 2 questions, which is the obligation of nation states to protect the climate and environment from human-caused greenhouse gas emissions for present and future generations. And secondly, what are the legal consequences where harm has been caused by those actions if such an obligation does exist? And again, those consequences are being explored in relation to the small island developing states and in relation to present and future generations. So as an eye to the timeline, first of all, the logistics. So as I say, it was initiated in 2021. And then in March of last year, we saw a resolution in the UN General Assembly, which basically approved the requesting of this opinion. And then public hearings are due to start next month, and then the opinion should come sometime next year. So this is a really, really interesting development, actually, because it's exploring the, I suppose, upper limits of our states' actions and impacts on the environment. I mean, historically, we have really treated the climate and the environment like a sort of endless resource that we can use and treat as we wish. And now we're really becoming alive to the consequences of doing so. I mean, we've heard directly from Toni earlier about the impacts in Palau, and there are so many similar stories around the world that we really need this clarity from a body like the International Court of Justice to say, actually, the nation states do have an obligation to protect the climate and the environment. You can't just treat it as you wish. And really what will be interesting will be this point about what the consequences are, what is owed if that obligation is recognized, what are the consequences where it's been breached. And I think another analogous movement which is happening, again, led by the Pacific Island nations, is to have ecocide recognized as a 5th international crime at the International Criminal Court. So we saw a couple months ago that 3 Pacific Island nations, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, made a submission at the International Criminal Court for ecocide to be recognized as a 5th international crime. And for those that don't know, in very brief terms, ecocide would be a crime by which substantial, long-term, severe harm to the environment would be recognized as an international crime. And the reason this is being sought is because it would introduce personal liability for the perpetrators of that crime, whether they are heads of government or directors of companies. It adds a different angle to the kind of legal consequences which could follow from harming the environment, where usually in our existing legal frameworks, we see civil liabilities that might fall on companies themselves rather than the directors. And often we see sovereign immunity, which would prevent heads of government themselves becoming liable. So it is hoped, a real sense of sobering of the mind of these individuals that are carrying out these acts, that they themselves could be held liable for doing this. But of course, there is a whole process by which ecocide would be recognized as an international crime. So the submission is the first step. Following that, there would be negotiations between all the parties. at the International Criminal Court. So those are the parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Following that, there would need to be a vote to amend that statute, which requires a 2/3 majority. And then after that, to actually start enforcing that crime, states would need to then individually ratify it. And I mean, I think my understanding of the Stop Ecocide international movement, of which I've been part of in the past, is that, you know, they recognize that there are certainly barriers to making ecocide a crime and then enforcing it. We've seen lots of states which, you know, are party to conventions but don't then ratify it within their own domestic laws. The US is, you know, notoriously terrible for doing that. But it's really, again, similar to this advisory opinion about creating this paradigm shift in which we're saying, what are the upper limits of human behavior and human impact on the environment? Because at the moment, it often feels like there's no recognition for a limit on how we can treat the climate and the environment. And both of these legal initiatives are taking big steps towards us kind of thinking about our place and our relationship to the earth. And seeing these two movements progress will do wonders for creating that paradigm shift and sort of all the additional consequences that flow from that, both in emboldening environmental advocates, indigenous communities and others which are leading climate action, and just reframing the relationship between us and the planet, which is so, so necessary.
Can I ask you both, if this wasn't a COP, wasn't a conference of parties, but instead was a COPY, I guess, a conference of parties youth, how different do you think its decisions would be? And what decisions do you think it would make? Toni, do you want to take that one on first?
I don't know if there was a copy, if the decisions would be different. I do think that we have the power to change the entire thing itself. From what I understand, the procedures of COP came after a really difficult time in our history. And it may have worked then, but I don't think we've really put into consideration how fast our technology has advanced, or even how deep and how serious our problems in climate change are, and how much space we've given our young people in a very short time. I think if there was a copy and our youth were there to make decisions, they would most likely turn it up on its head and try to work in a way that feels more inclusive of everybody. Just from what I've observed, all of our countries, our delegations, we come together, we create groups for the common interest. We fight for our own countries, our small island developing states, our LDCs, what havings and what nots. But for the youth, the one overarching thing that we had in common is that we are young. And we are more resilient that way. And what else do you want to be but resilient in anything, in any case? And so I think if we had a copy, we would be making better informed decisions because we have COP, we have all these great leaders and these great examples, but we would also have the capacity to build on that, but also to create incredibly new pathways because we've had the chance to break barriers and really look at ourselves and believe that we are 100% change makers. And we believe that the decisions that we make aren't just for ourselves, but for all the youth, present and future generations.
That's a brilliant response. So thanks so much. And over to you, Charlie.
I think there's a really interesting question in terms of what would a conference of the party's youth look like. First of all, I'd like to echo the point that Tony was making. So I think generally young people they bring a lot of empathy to spaces like this. I would say on average, young people are more empathetic of the experiences of other young people around the world that are on the front lines of this climate crisis. I think thankfully, we're also seeing that young people are more aware of the climate science as well, which is something that's so important. I mean, it feels like an obvious thing to say, but there are a lot of people in spaces like COP who really aren't across the science of what's happening, and it leads to all sorts of strange anomalies and delays in these talks, where I would say that I feel like young people are more aware of really what's going on and the technical side of the climate crisis too. But that being said as well, I think a big part of youth advocacy is highlighting the fact that young people are not a monolithic group. We do have so much diversity, and that includes diversity of opinion as well. I mean, my own experience with the G20 youth last year showed me that just within, my counterparts amongst those other 19 countries, there was so much difference in opinion in what climate solutions should be prioritized, how we should bring different groups into the decision-making process, even the speed at which we need to start implementing the change. All of these things, there was so much difference of opinion. And then expanding that out to a space like this theoretical conference of the party's youth, it would be even more so. Because there are young people in societies that are entrenched in fossil fuels, where the economy is dependent on fossil fuels. And to them, that's their livelihoods of their family, friends, and most likely themselves in the future. So they themselves are already invested in that system. So in a way, I sort of sympathize again with what Tony was saying, that it might not necessarily lead to decisions that are that different, having it all be youth in a COP process. However, what I think is really different and is really change-making is about the approach by which we look at this decision-making. And I think that's where the value of the YNA comes in breaking down these barriers between delegations and fostering better and closer ties and relationships between negotiators from different parts of the world. I mean, the impact we see working with the YNA is that every single day where those relationships are leveraged to advance talks, to build empathy between people from different places, is really, really the phenomenal work of the YNA. And I think if we had a conference of parties of youth where we not only just had young people from around the world, but also we had structures which built empathy between them, then that is where we would see really progressive and bolder action, which is what we so desperately need.
Thanks, Toni and Charlie, for those wonderful comments. See you next time.